Hold my beer. This week we're reviewing a true story of patriotism, friendship, and beer. Here are 5 things you will love about the greatest beer run ever. This story begins at a bar in Inwood, a neighborhood at the northern tip of Manhattan. Back in the 1960s, New York was still a major seaport, and Inwood was a working-class neighborhood before hipsters moved in and ruined everything. The Vietnam War was on its 3rd year, and protesters became hostile towards troops and recruits. The watering hole regulars are angry at these protesters and come up with an idea, and that leads us to number 1, bar wisdom. The man who runs the local bar is called Colonel, and as they watch the war protesters on the news, he comes up with an idea. Someone should go over there and bring our boys some beers to let them know that we're thinking about them back home. And there are quite a few Inwood natives serving in Vietnam. Inwood is typical of many New York neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else, and they all grew up together. This all unfolds in the first chapter, and I immediately identified with this concept of bar wisdom, because as a writer, I've come up with quite a few of my crazy ideas while perched at a bar. And here's some worldly advice for you. Write down all your drunk ideas, because you're not going to remember them the next day. If you don't have a pen, you can even download a simple notepad app for your phone. I have a short story collection up on Amazon, and believe it or not, most of the ideas for them were fueled by high-octane spirits. But back to our story. When the Colonel announces this idea to the bar patrons, one hand goes up in the air, a volunteer, and that leads us to number 2, John Chicky Donahue. The main character of our story is named Chickie, and he's a Marine who served in Japan during the 1950s and now works on cargo ships. He has a union card and credentials to travel internationally and sees himself as the perfect candidate for the job. He makes a list of neighborhood friends who are serving and finds out from family members where they are deployed. Next, he loads some local brand beers into a backpack and heads to a cargo ship which is departing for Queen Nan, a port in South Vietnam. Now, just to reiterate, you will find this book in the non-fiction section of your bookstore. This is a true story. Chickie is a real guy, and he actually did this. Now, Chickie is an interesting fella. As a seafarer, he's been to ports all over the world and has had his share of troubles, as he recounts when he was once arrested. Like that time in Durban, South Africa, when I was cuffed and arrested by 6 cops for drinking in a coloreds-only club. The dancing in that place was a lot more fun than Little White's all-night apartheid hideaway, let me tell you. And everyone has at least one friend like Chickie. You can tell that Chickie has quite a few stories to tell, and his life could probably be turned into quite a few books. He was a union boss who used unorthodox methods to get management to cave to worker demands. During a Teamsters strike at the New York Times, he diverted printing paper shipments to prevent the Times from outsourcing the printing to Canada. He got his fellow track workers to lose a train somewhere in North Dakota, and when Congress threatened to cut funding for one of New York's tunneling projects, he locked the politicians in a tunnel during a tour to help them see the light. He sounds like the kind of guy who would volunteer for such a beer run and isn't afraid to use his wits and brass balls to get what he wants. On the cargo ship, he works in the engine room, and they go through the Panama Canal, transverse the Pacific, and finally end up in Queen Nan, a port city in South Vietnam. A side note, if you ever want to learn about what it's like to be on a cargo ship, check out a YouTuber by the name of Brian Boyle. It looks like endless boredom, but his videos are thoroughly watchable. But back to our book. Chickie begs the cargo ship captain to let him go ashore while the ship is unloading. For security reasons, they unload the cargo onto barges, and the barges sail to the actual port. He manages to get the captain's permission for shore leave, and that leads us to number 3, the first beer. The first person on his list is a childhood friend who is an MP at Queen Nan Port. When he arrives, he gets escorted by MPs, and he simply asks them if they know his friend, Tommy Collins. And to his surprise, the MPs say, yeah, we know Tommy. He's waiting at the dock for a shift rotation. So the first person on his list comes pretty easy. His childhood friend is perplexed as to why he's there, so Chickie simply pulls a beer from his backpack and hands it to him and tells him everyone in the neighborhood back home is thinking about him. This had me laughing out loud, since it would be such a surprise to have someone come halfway across the world just to hand you a can of beer. But it works. His friend is blown away by the gesture. They go to a bar and sing Irish drinking songs with other men in Tommy's unit. The first beer on the list really pounds home what this book is about. His friend, as well as the other troops he's serving with, are grateful that this man would travel all the way over and let them know that people back home are thinking about them. All it takes is one beer, but it shows how a small gesture can have far-reaching ramifications. The next morning, he parts ways to find the next person on his list who is much closer to the North Vietnam border at Quang Tri. He's able to hitch beach rides on planes, helicopters, jeeps, and armored personnel carriers. If you're wondering how he's able to move so freely among the military units as a civilian, it's because everyone in charge suspects that he's in the CIA. He doesn't identify himself as such, but he wears civilian clothes, and Chickie has a certain manner about himself when he asks for favors as though he expects people to oblige him without much resistance. If you've ever seen Catch Me If You Can, Frank Abagnale Jr. would be proud of his tactics. By the time we get to the third beer run on his list, I was still laughing and crying as I read. I really hoped he'd use up all the beers in his pack. Never underestimate the power of beer, as Chickie observes. They popped the cans open and, to a man, closed their eyes as they took their first sip of beer in a while. Maybe they saw their girlfriends or a beach back home. This book reminded me that small acts of kindness can have great effects. It made me think back to each small act someone did for me that I still remember to this day. Funny, but the people who did these acts are probably not aware of the effect they had on me. Each beer reminds the troops that the old neighborhood back in Inwood, New York is with them all the way out in this foreign land. Ironically, he's able to knock off the first few names on his list with ease, but he runs into some difficulty, and that leads us to number 4, the Tet Offensive. When Chickie is back in Saigon listening to fireworks for the Vietnamese New Year, a funny thing happens. The fireworks get closer, and then they seem to be shaking the ground. It turns out the opening days of the Tet Offensive have begun. If you're unaware of what the Tet Offensive is, Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. It's a major holiday where Vietnamese folks return home to visit family. The North called a truce, which President Johnson agreed to. Many troops from the North were able to visit their families in Laos and Cambodia, but the only problem was they weren't. They were using it as an excuse to plan an offensive by moving troops into the western border. Instead of invading from the north, they invaded from the west and caught Saigon completely by surprise. They were able to take over the U.S. Embassy and the President's palace. Chickie is caught in the middle of this and has to somehow survive and still find a way back to his ship, which is now docked in Manila. This midpoint of the story occupies quite a bit of time as Chickie works hard to get a passport and visa to leave for the Philippines. Locals, South Vietnamese police, and random strangers offer him help. I really enjoyed these parts of the book because it really felt like the good karma Chickie was bringing over was now being returned to him. His good acts have paid off, and now others were bringing the goodwill back to him. It shows a universal truth that war brings out the worst in humanity, but it can also bring out the best. Number 5, Chickie's return home. Eventually, Chickie is able to find a way home, and he is humbled by the experience of surviving the Tet Offensive. After witnessing the vast differences between what our leaders told us about the war and what was actually happening on the ground in Saigon, he comes to distrust our leaders and understands why the anti-war protesters were doing what they were doing. Gradually, I began to see that the protesters, however disrespectfully, were at least trying to stop this madness. If there's one thing that I learned as a result of my Vietnam experience, it's that government, all governments for that matter, are not to be trusted. That knowledge served me well in the work I went into, representing the Sandhogs Union, construction trades, and other union workers. I can't bring back the boys who died, but I can help their brothers and sisters. I hope I've done a little bit of good. By the end of the book, I was inspired that small acts of kindness can have profound effects on people. You imagine these young men out in the jungle, and perhaps a single warm beer from a backpack, representing the idea that others back home were thinking about them, kept them going, and gave them the reason to endure the war and make it home safely. The story is funny, fast-paced, and inspirational, and you feel like Chickie has grown as a person because of his experiences. The book is worth checking out. That's it for this week. I mentioned Bar Wisdom earlier, so please check out my own alcohol-fueled idea that I turned into a book, Grand Portage, about a man who drags a nuclear aircraft carrier across northern Minnesota. I definitely had a few in me when I came up with this idea. It's available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. Stay tuned for other great book reviews. Coming up is Bright Lights Big City, Catcher in the Rye, and Orwell's 1984. Thanks for watching, and never stop reading.